You trained them. You advocated for them. You covered them when it cost you your credibility. You handed them something sacred, and then they mishandled it. They rewrote the story. They undermined the values. They treated stewardship like entitlement. And suddenly, you weren't just disappointed. You were wounded. Because professional betrayal doesn't just hurt your work. It attacks your discernment. It makes you question your judgment, your generosity, your ability to trust again. And if you're not careful, that wound doesn't stay contained. It hardens, it calcifies, it turns into a bitterness that quietly poisons the next season God is trying to lead you into. This episode is not about pretending it didn't hurt. And it's not about spiritualizing your way around pain. It's about removing the shrapnel without letting infection set in. Because bitterness is never neutral. It always spreads. And leaders who don't deal with betrayal properly end up bleeding on people who never cut them. Today, we're going to talk about how to protect your heart without shrinking your leadership, how to acknowledge betrayal without becoming cynical, and how to release what happened without carrying it into what's next. So let me name the tension right up front, because betrayal hits leaders differently. Not because leaders are fragile, but because leaders invest more than they're ever credited for. You don't just manage tasks, you shape culture. You don't just delegate responsibility, you entrust values. And when someone violates that trust, the injury is layered. There's this loss of confidence, the loss of shared vision, the loss of safety. And underneath all of that, there's a quieter grief. It's the grief of realizing that what you were building meant more to you than it did to them. Y'all, that's not weakness. That's reality. And here's where things get dangerous, because unresolved betrayal doesn't just stay in the past. It shows up as guardedness, suspicion, control, emotional distance disguised as wisdom. And over time, leaders don't just protect themselves, they shrink. They stop mentoring deeply. They stop advocating boldly. They stop trusting their instincts, not because they lack capacity, but because bitterness is trying to keep them safe. This episode is about interrupting that cycle, not by denying the wound, but by addressing it honestly, so you can lead whole, not harden. And before we talk about what to do with betrayal, we need to understand what betrayal actually does to us. So betrayal hurts because it violates expectation, but professional betrayal cuts deeper because it violates meaning. And leaders don't just trade in tasks, they trade in trust. You didn't just give someone a role. You gave them access to your thinking, to your values, to the why behind the work. You showed them how decisions were made, how people were protected, how integrity showed up when no one was watching. And when that is dismissed or mishandled, the pain is not abstract. It's personal. Even if you tell yourself it shouldn't be. Because here's what leaders rarely say out loud. Betrayal doesn't just make you angry. It makes you question your discernment. You start replaying moments, that meeting, that conversation, that gut feeling you overrode because you wanted to believe the best. You wonder where you misread things, where you were too generous, where you were too patient. And for leaders who value self-awareness, that questioning feels responsible. But there's a line where reflection turns into self-suspicion. And when leaders cross that line, something subtle happens. They don't just become more cautious, they become less available. Watch this. They become less open, less willing to extend trust without a safety net, not because they've grown wiser, but because pain has gone unprocessed. Here's the part that most leaders miss. Betrayal often hurts more after the moment has passed, not during the transition you're managing. You're regulating, staying professional, but later when the noise quiets, the grief shows up. You realize what you were actually grieving, not the role, not the outcome, but the shared understanding you thought existed. And that's where betrayal really lands for leaders. It doesn't just disrupt what you were doing, it disrupts who you believed yourself to be in the room. The leader who saw potential, the leader who invested wisely, the leader who knew when to trust and when to hold back. Betrayal doesn't just make you grieve what was lost. It makes you quietly question whether you can trust your own judgment again. The belief that you were aligned, and that grief creates a dangerous temptation. You're tempted to become smaller, to pull back, to stop offering your full leadership presence. You don't say it loud. You just tell yourself, I'll be more careful next time. What is it? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And careful sounds wise until you realize it's costing you presence. But careful can quietly turn into closed. And closed leaders don't lead freely. They lead from a place of defense. And that's why professional betrayal is so dangerous, not because of what it took from you then, but because of what it threatens to take from you next. Wow, that does hit me a little bit. Scripture calls bitterness a root for a reason. You see, roots grow underground. They're quiet. They tend to go unnoticed until they start choking everything else. Now, bitterness doesn't announce itself as bitterness. It shows up as sarcasm, cynicism, disengagement, hyper independence, as I'll just do it myself. And the danger is this: you can be right about what happened and still be wrong in how you carry it. Betrayal does not give you permission to become someone you're not. And bitterness always asks for more than it gives. It promises protection, but it costs you clarity. And if left unchecked, it will have you rehearsing the past while missing the invitation of the present. So the question is not, did it hurt? The question is, what is it doing inside you now? And to answer that honestly, we have to talk about how betrayal lives, not just in your thoughts, but in your body. So let's talk about why betrayal doesn't just stay in your head. Because for many leaders, this is where the confusion starts. You'll say things like, I'm good. I've forgiven them. Yo, I'm not angry. I've moved on. And spiritually, that might even be true. But then your body does something else. Your chest tightens when a certain name comes up. Your shoulders lift when you walk into certain rooms. You replay conversations you thought you were done with. You wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning thinking about emails you'll never send. And you start wondering, what is wrong with me? Nothing's wrong with you. It's your nervous system responding to a threat to safety. It's not a bad attitude. See, here's what most people don't understand about betrayal. It is not processed by the brain as disappointment. It's processed as danger. When someone you trusted violates that trust, your brain doesn't file that away as information. It files it as a warning. You know, the amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for detecting threat, it lightens up. And once it does, your body goes into vigilance, not panic, vigilance. It's that low-grade state where you're always scanning, always alert, always slightly on edge. And see, this is why betrayal doesn't just make you sad. It makes you alert. It makes you cautious, hyper aware of tone, timing, and motive. Your body is saying, last time we trusted, we got hurt. Let's not let that happen again. And here's the part leaders need to hear. Your body does not know this is professional. It just knows trust was violated. It doesn't differentiate between a personal relationship and a leadership one. So a breach of trust is a breach of safety. And once safety is compromised, your system adapts. That adaptation looks like wisdom at first. You tell yourself you're just being discerning now. I know so many people that all of a sudden have developed this gift of discernment. More careful, you're more intentional. But over time, this vigilance becomes exhausting because your nervous system was never designed to stay on watch forever. And so this is why betrayal lingers even after forgiveness. Forgiveness is a decision. Safety is a sensation. And those two don't always resolve at the same time or at the same speed. You can forgive someone spiritually and still be physiologically guarded. That doesn't make you fake. It makes you human. And leaders, especially leaders of integrity, often miss this because you're used to regulating. You're used to carrying weight. You're used to staying composed. So instead of exploding, you internalize. Instead of lashing out, you tighten up. Instead of processing, you push through. And what you don't process emotionally, your body holds on to it physically. This is why leaders after betrayal often describe things like feeling tired in ways rest doesn't fix, losing patience faster than usual, becoming more irritable without knowing why, feeling heavy in rooms they once loved. Y'all, that's not weakness. That's your system saying, I'm still protecting you. But here's the danger. Protection that goes unexamined turns into posture, and posture turns into leadership style. You see, you start leading defensively. You start anticipating disappointment. You start expecting people to let you down, not consciously, but subtly. And expectation is powerful because when you expect betrayal, you unconsciously lead in ways that invite distance. You pull back. You over control. You stop offering full access. You withhold clarity or trust until people prove themselves. And people feel that. Then they may not name it, but they feel it. Now, let me say something carefully here. This is not about blaming you for being betrayed. There are genuinely harmful people. There are selfish people. There are disloyal people. There are people who misuse access. That is real. But there is also a moment after betrayal where leadership maturity asks a harder question. It's not why did they do this, but what has this done to how I show up now? Because unresolved betrayal doesn't just hurt the past. it shapes the future. And if you don't slow down long enough to understand what's happening inside your body and brain, you're going to start making leadership decisions from protection instead of purpose. You'll call it wisdom, but it will be fear with a leadership vocabulary. This is why some leaders become controlling after betrayal. Not because they're power hungry. Control feels like safety. This is why some leaders become distant. Not because they don't care. Distance feels like protection. And this is why some leaders stop mentoring deeply, not because they're selfish. Vulnerability feels risky now. And none of that makes you a bad leader, but it does make you a tired one. Because vigilance costs energy, and energy depletion is often the first signal that something deeper needs attention. This is why bitterness is so sneaky. It doesn't show up as rage. It shows up as fatigue. It shows up as cynicism, as I'm done with people. And when bitterness settles into the nervous system, it's over. It doesn't just affect how you feel. It affects how you interpret. You start reading neutral behavior as suspicious. You start assuming motives instead of asking questions. And that's when leadership becomes heavy. Not because the work changed, because your body is still guarding a wound that never fully healed. And so this is why we can't rush past this part, because before we talk about ownership, before we can talk about boundaries, before we talk about release, we have to acknowledge what betrayal did inside you. Not to shame you, but to free you, because clarity begins where compassion meets truth. And until you understand how betrayal impacted your psychology and physiology, you'll keep trying to solve a nervous system issue with willpower and scripture alone. And scripture never asks you to bypass your humanity. It asks you to steward it, which brings us to the next hard but necessary turn in this conversation. If betrayal changes how we lead, and if our bodies adapt to protect us, then at some point, ownership requires us to ask a different question. Not just what did they do to me, but what did this experience teach me about how I lead, how I set boundaries, and how I allow people access? That's where we're going next. Now, I'm going to slow this down before we go any further, because whenever we start talking about ownership in the same breath as betrayal, something tightens up in the room. Some leaders immediately hear accusation. Others hear guilt. And some of you are already saying internally, okay, so now this is my fault too, Dr. Mike. No, I haven't said that. And that's not what this is. Ownership is not self-blame. And if you confuse those two, you'll either stay stuck in resentment or you'll collapse into shame. Neither one, by the way, leads to freedom. You see, ownership is not about rewriting the story to make yourself the villain. It's about reclaiming agency in a story where something was taken from you. Now, martyrdom says, this happened to me and there was nothing I could do. While ownership says, this happened to me and I still get to choose how I lead going forward. There is a difference. And leaders need that difference, because there are, in fact, truly harmful people who lie. They manipulate, they misuse access, they take advantage of grace. There's people who betray trust without remorse, and naming that does not make you bitter, it makes you honest. But leadership maturity asks a second question after honesty, not to excuse them, not to minimize the harm, but to prevent repetition. And that question is this: what part of this is mine to own, not to carry, but to learn from? Again, that's not martyrdom, that's wisdom. You see, martyrdom keeps you frozen in the moment of betrayal, while ownership allows you to move forward without pretending nothing happened. And this is where a lot of leaders get tripped up, because we swing between two extremes. You know, either we say they did me wrong and that's the end of the story, or we say I should have known better. This all on me. My bad. Both are incomplete, by the way. You see, the first keeps you powerless, and the second makes you cruel to yourself. Now, ownership, it lives right in the middle. It says, you know, something wrong happened, and I still have something to examine, not to punish myself, but to protect my future. Now, here's where it gets a little uncomfortable. Sometimes we didn't create the betrayal, but we ignored early signals because we didn't want to disrupt the peace. Sometimes we didn't cause the behavior, but we tolerated patterns that should have been interrupted sooner. And sometimes we didn't create the monster, but we didn't challenge it while it was still small. And see, leaders need to hear this clearly. Grace without boundaries is not leadership. It's avoidance dressed up as kindness. And that doesn't mean you walk in harsh. It doesn't mean you have to lead like a disciplinarian, but it does mean you lead with clarity early. And this is why ownership matters, not so you can blame yourself for being betrayed, but so you don't repeat the same pattern with a different person, a different team, or a different season. Because if you don't examine what you tolerated, you'll just call it bad luck when it happens again. And leadership doesn't get the luxury of luck. It requires learning. Let me say this carefully. Owning your part does not mean you deserved what happened. It just means you're unwilling to stay stuck in it. It means you refuse to let one season define how you show up in the next. It means you're choosing growth over guilt. And here's the part that matters spiritually. Scripture never asks us to deny harm. It asks us to walk in truth. And truth includes naming patterns. It includes self-examination. I'm asking God not just to heal what hurt us, but to sharpen how we lead. See, that's why this is not martyrdom. Martyrdom says, I'll just suffer quietly and I'm going to call it faith. Ownership says, I am not going to bleed on people who never cut me. You see, it says, I'm not going to punish my future because of my past. I'm going to lead with clarity, not cynicism. And if that stirs something in you, that's a good sign, because it means you're not trying to avoid the work. You're ready to do it honestly. You see, ownership doesn't stop at insight. It demands a different way of leading next time, which brings us to the next step, because ownership doesn't stop at insight. It has to move into practice. And the next place it shows up is in how we set boundaries early and clearly before disappointment has a chance to harden into bitterness. And so that's where we're headed next. You see, this is where leadership gets real practical, because once we talk about ownership without martyrdom, the next question becomes obvious. Well, what do I do differently next time? For most leaders, the answer lives right here. One of the biggest leadership lessons I share with supervisors and managers over and over again is this. It's always easier to pull back than it is to tighten up later. Always. When you start loose and then try to tighten the reins, people experience that as punishment and they feel blindsided. They feel corrected instead of guided. When you start clear and then soften as trust is built, people will feel safer. They know the expectations and they know the boundaries. They know the lane, and clarity feels like care. You see, people are people, and people will do whatever they can as long as they can get away with it, right? And as long as you let them get away with it, they're going to people. And so this is where ownership gets practical, because part of leadership is understanding that some people genuinely need to be taught how to treat you. Y'all, don't be giving speeches though. Doing it through frustration, it doesn't really work out the way you're hoping. But how it does work is through consistency, through what you allow, through what you interrupt, through what you correct early instead of carrying quietly. And this is where leaders who care deeply often struggle, because you don't want to micromanage and you don't want to be heavy-handed. I'll say it, y'all. You want to be the friend. You don't want to damage the relationship. So instead, you absorb, you cover, smooth things over. You tell yourself you're being patient. Patience without truth eventually turns into resentment. And resentment doesn't make you wiser. Again, it makes you tired. Now, here's where this connects back to betrayal. When leaders skip boundaries early, betrayal feels shocking. But when leaders establish clarity early, disappointment becomes instructive instead of devastating. You still may be hurt. You still may be disappointed, but you're not blindsided. And there's a big difference between pain you can place and pain that disorients you, which brings us to the next layer we have to name, because boundaries don't land the same way for everyone. Different generations interpret loyalty, correction, and trust differently. And if leaders don't understand that, they'll misread response as resistance and disappointment as disloyalty. And that's where we're going next. And this is where leaders get confused, because not everyone hears boundaries the same way. So I'm going to go ahead and just complicate this conversation just enough to make it honest, because betrayal doesn't land the same way for everyone. Boundaries don't land the same way for everyone. And trust doesn't mean the same thing across generations. So this is where a lot of leadership breakdown happens. Not because someone is wrong, but because people are operating from different formative experiences. They have different definitions of loyalty, different expectations of authority, different assumptions about what leadership owes them. And when leaders don't account for that, disappointment gets misread as defiance, and discernment gets labeled as disloyal. And let me walk through this carefully. And by the way, I am not trying to stereotype. I'm just trying to contextualize, because context builds compassion, and compassion sharpens leadership. So for many boomers, these are those who were born, let's see, between 1945 and 1963, loyalty was learned through endurance. You stayed, you pushed through, you didn't question authority publicly. You proved commitment by suffering quietly. So betrayal for that generation often feels like abandonment. If you leave, if you question, if you challenge the system, it can feel personal, like a violation of an unspoken contract. See, boundaries in that framework were often implicit. You learned them by watching, and correction was usually top down. So tightening later didn't always feel strange. It was actually expected. Now, contrast with Gen X. Gen X grew up watching institutions fail. right? So this is those of you born between 1964 and about 1982, 83, right? Gen X grew up watching institutions fail, like I said. They saw layoffs. They saw broken promises. They saw loyalty go unrewarded. They learned self-reliance early. Remember latchkey kids, right? Don't trust systems too much. They don't give full access too fast. They tend to protect themselves, and so boundaries feel necessary. But trust is slow. And when leaders suddenly tighten expectations, Next doesn't always experience that as guidance. They experience it as a confirmation. This is why I didn't fully trust in the first place. Now I want you to go ahead and layer in the millennials, those born between 1983 and about 1996. Millennials were formed in a values-driven era. They were told to bring their whole selves, to look for meaning in everything, to expect transparency, to question leadership that didn't align with stated values. You see, for many millennials, betrayal isn't just about broken trust, it's about misalignment. You said this mattered, and then you acted differently. Boundaries, when clear, actually feel safe to them, but inconsistency feels like dishonesty. So when leaders don't name expectations early, millennials fill in the gaps with assumption. And when tightening happens later, it can feel like a bait and switch. Now, Gen Zers, you're the ones born after 1996, grew up in full transparency. I mean, screenshots, receipts, public accountability. They're a generation that does not know the world without the internet. They expect clarity. They expect consistency. They expect answers. They expect feedback early and often. And for Gen Z, betrayal often feels like ambiguity. Silence is suspicious. Vagueness feels unsafe. And unspoken expectations, those are traps. So when leaders say, you should have known, Gen Z hears, you set me up. Now here's why this matters. Because leaders often interpret reactions through their own generational lenses. See, a boomer leader may see a millennial's questions as disloyalty. A Gen X leader may see Gen Z's need for clarity as entitlement. A millennial leader may see a boomer's endurance as passivity. And suddenly, what's really a difference in formation gets labeled as betrayal. And see, this is where leadership maturity shows up, because discernment asks a better question. Not why are they like this, but what assumptions are we bringing into this relationship that were never named? This is why boundaries are so critical across generations, because boundaries translate values into language everyone can understand. They remove the guesswork, they reduce misinterpretation, they prevent disappointment from hardening into resentment. And when leaders don't establish boundaries clearly, different generations fill in the gaps differently, which means betrayal becomes a moving target. One person feels betrayed because expectations changed. Another feels betrayed because expectations were never stated. And another feels betrayed because loyalty wasn't rewarded the way they expected. And there the leader is sitting in the middle thinking, how do we get here? This, my friends, is where ownership intersects with wisdom. Because effective leaders don't assume shared meaning, they create it. They don't assume loyalty looks the same to everyone. They define it. They don't assume trust is automatic. They build it intentionally. And when leaders fail to do that, betrayal feels louder than it needs to be. Not because the harm wasn't real, but because it wasn't contextualized. Let me say this plainly. Some betrayals are moral failures. Some betrayals are character issues. And some betrayals are collisions of expectation that were never clarified. Leadership requires a discernment to tell the difference, because if you treat every disappointment as a character flaw, you're going to become cynical. And if you treat every betrayal as misunderstanding, you'll become naive. Wisdom lives between those extremes, which brings us to the part of this conversation we can't avoid any longer, because when betrayal goes unresolved and when boundaries are unclear, something else starts to happen inside leaders. They don't just respond to the people in front of them, they start responding to ghosts from the past. They expect betrayal everywhere, and that expectation quietly reshapes how they lead. And that's where we're going next. So when leaders experience betrayal, part of the work is asking whether this was a character failure or a collision of unspoken expectations. So here's the quiet trap. Leaders keep replaying betrayal because part of them is still trying to fix it. You replay conversations in your head. I know I do. I imagine what I should have said. I've drafted responses I'm never going to send. I've rehearsed explanations for people who are no longer listening. Not because I'm stuck in the past, but because some part of me still believes clarity is going to bring closure. You see, to explain, to clarify, to correct the narrative. But the need to be understood can tether you to the very thing God is asking you to release. You see, you don't need vindication to move forward. You need alignment. And alignment often comes with, silence. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that alignment is sometimes louder than explanation. Unprocessed betrayal doesn't just affect your emotions, it affects your decisions. You become cautious where you once were courageous. You lead from memory instead of discernment. You start managing risk instead of stewarding calling. You hesitate longer than you used to. You second guess decisions you once made with confidence. You require more proof before extending trust, not because the moment demands it, but because the memory does. And when memory replaces discernment, leadership slowly loses its edge. And over time, your leadership becomes reactive instead of responsive. And that's not wisdom, that's woundedness. Healing doesn't make you naive, it makes you clear. Clear leaders don't ignore risk. They just don't let fear run the room. This is the part most leaders don't realize they've crossed. There's a moment after betrayal where protection slowly turns into expectation. It's not conscious, it's not malicious, it's just subtle. You stop reacting to what's actually happening in front of you and start responding to what happened before. You don't say it out loud, but something in you shifts. You start assuming people will disappoint you. You start bracing for the other shoe to drop. You start leading as if betrayal is not a possibility, but a probability. And that's understandable because your system learned something. Last time I trusted like that, it hurt. Last time I gave access like that, it cost me. Last time I extended grace like that, it backfired. So your mind and body do what they were designed to do. They try to keep you safe. But here's where it gets dangerous. When betrayal becomes the lens, it doesn't just protect you from harm, it distorts how you interpret people. You see, you start reading neutral behavior as suspect. You hear feedback as challenge. You experience questions as resistance. You see distance before it's actually there. And without realizing it, you begin leading in ways that leave people with no good options. Because when leaders expect betrayal, they often create conditions where trust can't grow. You see, you withhold access, you over control information, you delay affirmation, you test loyalty instead of cultivating it. And here's the painful irony. Leaders who fear betrayal often end up creating the very distance they're trying to avoid, not because their team is disloyal, but because trust can't survive under suspicion. And this is where the romantic relationship analogy helps. Anyone who has been cheated on knows this pattern. You say you've forgiven. You say you're moving forward, but every new relationship is forced to pay a debt it didn't incur. You question intentions, you read into silence, you brace for disappointment, and eventually the relationship collapses under the weight of a past wound, not because the new person did anything wrong, but because they were never given a clean slate. And leaders do this with teams all the time. You punish current people for what former people did. You manage your present through your past, and the cost is almost always higher than the protection ever was. And then you wonder why morale is low, why trust feels thin, why people don't lean in the way you hope they would. This is one of the quietest forms of leadership drift because it doesn't feel like bitterness. It feels like wisdom. You tell yourself you're just being realistic now, but realism without healing becomes cynicism, and cynicism, that's corrosive. It slowly eats away at curiosity, generosity, at hope, passion even. Empathy. And this is why unresolved betrayal is so costly. Not because it keeps you angry, but because it keeps you guarded. And guarded leaders don't lead with freedom. They lead with fear dressed up as strategy. Now, I'm going to say this as gently as I can, but I'm going to also make sure I'm clear. Your team should not have to prove they are not the people who hurt you. That burden is too heavy and it's not fair. Leadership requires the courage to separate past harm from present reality. That doesn't mean you forget what happened. It just means you refuse to let it script what comes next. And this is where release becomes essential. Not release is denial. Release is discernment. Release says, I acknowledge what happened and I refuse to let it dictate my posture. Release says, I will not build policies around one person's failure. Release says, I will not lead as if everyone is a threat. And this is where the earlier work matters because you can't release what you haven't named. You can't change a lens you don't recognize, and you can't lead differently until you admit how betrayal has shaped you. This is not about becoming naive again. It's about becoming clear. Clear leaders don't ignore risk. They just don't let fear sit in the driver's seat. Clear leaders don't pretend betrayal won't happen. They just refuse to expect it everywhere. And when leaders make that shift, something powerful happens. Trust begins to rebuild. Energy returns, joy resurfaces, not because the work got easier, but because the weight got lighter. Which brings us to the final movement of this conversation, because insight without action still leaves the work unfinished. And leadership always requires a next step. So this is where we slow it down, not to minimize the betrayal, but to keep it from defining you. I like to call this the bitter root audit. So there's 4 movements with this, not to excuse what happened, but to free you from carrying it forward. The first one is this: name the specific hurt. You see, generalized pain, it keeps you stuck. So you got to be specific in the language so that you can create movement. Not they betrayed me, but I am hurt because my trust was violated when they did this. And name what was rejected: your wisdom, your values, your leadership, your covering. Pain unnamed becomes pain repeated. Clarity is the first act of stewardship. All right, here's the second part to that. You have to separate the person from the pain. Again, this is not denial. This is just discernment. Their actions revealed their character, and your response, it reveals yours. So if you let their failure define your posture, you gave them influence they no longer deserve. And you are not responsible for their immaturity, but you are responsible for what you allow to take root in you. Now, here's the third one. Pray the dangerous prayer. Now, this right here, I have clients that hesitate on this. I've had clients that when I get to this, they don't call me for a few weeks. God, show me my part. This is not to blame yourself. It's actually to release yourself. Was I unclear? Did I overfunction? Did I build dependency instead of capability? This prayer, y'all, is not about excusing them. It's about refining you, because insight breaks bitterness faster than outrage ever will. Now, you've done all 3 of those things. Here's the final piece. You have to set a boundary in your mind. Now, this is internal. It's not performative. I release them to their own journey and their own consequences. I choose to protect my peace, not police their failure. You don't need closure from them to have freedom within yourself. Boundaries are not walls. They're filters. And this one keeps bitterness out. Release is not approval. Release is refusal. Refusal to let the past define the future. Refusal to carry weight that no longer belongs to you. Refusal to let betrayal rewrite your identity. You can acknowledge what happened without narrating your life through it. And here's the quiet truth. The season after betrayal is often the one that requires the most tenderness, not toughness, because God is not just protecting your next assignment, He's protecting your heart. So I want you to do one thing this week, just one. I want you to run one past professional hurt through the bitter root audit. And I want you to complete this sentence honestly. To protect my peace, I release my need to control or critique the outcome of blank. Do not rush it. And please don't spiritualize it. You just got to be truthful, because bitterness loses power the moment it's brought into the light. So let me leave you with this. Betrayal does not disqualify you. It clarifies you. It shows you what you value. It reveals what matters, and it invites you to choose who you will become next. You don't have to become bitter to be wise. You definitely don't have to become guarded to be discerning. You don't have to carry resentment to prove that it hurt. You can lead with clarity, with boundaries, with compassion, and without poison in your soul. Release does not mean you were wrong to trust. It just means you're strong enough to trust again, but do it differently. So if today's conversation stirred something in you, I want you to pay attention to that. Don't judge it, but I do want you to listen. And in the coming weeks, I'll be opening up a 30-day ownership shift challenge, not to fix you, but to give you space to process, to recalibrate and reclaim your leadership posture one day at a time. So if this episode resonated, the link is in the show notes. No pressure, just an invitation. And before you go, I want you to do these quick things. Subscribe wherever you listen. Is it Spotify? Is it Apple Podcasts? Is it YouTube? Make sure you subscribe, please, please, please. Then I want you also to share this episode with another person who's carrying something quietly. If you believe that this could be helpful for them, please hand it off to them. And if this landed with you, please leave a review, a comment, and tell me your one click from today. Read them all. They matter, and they help shape what comes next. So I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, stay clicked in.